Today is New Testament history and geography, and I debated a long time about which to start with because the geography is not very meaningful without the history, but you can't understand the history without the geography. So, we're going to start with a very basic map. You see on page 1 there's a little tic-tac-toe grid. So, take out your pen. I'm going to teach you a simple way to draw a basic map of Israel that will be very helpful for the rest of your life. Anytime you're anywhere, you can draw this. Be very simple. Okay, so starting at the top left, just inside the line, draw down, and then right at this vertex, you got a little bump for Mount Carmel. And then go down outside the line. All the way down. So there's your coastline between the Mediterranean Sea and Israel with a little bump at that vertex. And once you get down to this intersection here, then just start to curve it out down the road towards Egypt. And there's your whole coastline of Israel. And now, at this intersection here, you've got the Sea of Galilee, shaped like a little football. That is a huge freshwater lake. The Sea of Galilee, that's where Jesus walked on water. That's where Peter grew up in a fishing village on it. That's about 8 miles across and 13 miles long. And then flowing out of the lake is the Jordan River, straight down to the next intersection. That's the Jordan River where Jesus was baptized. And then at the top of this vertex is the Dead Sea, shaped like a little lopsided peanut. It's very long. That's the lowest point on earth. That's the saltiest body of water on earth.
That's the
Dead Sea. It's dead. It's called the Dead Sea because nothing can live in it. It's so salty that you can't. Your skin will start to burn after 45 minutes of being in there, and you can't. You cannot drown. You could fall asleep in the lake and you would float the whole time. So there's your basic geography of Israel right there. Very simple, and we'll add a couple cities. If you take this line here at the top of the Dead Sea, you go about a third of the way, and you've got Jerusalem. So right there, just with that, you've got the Mediterranean Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, Mount Carmel, Jerusalem. That's about all you need, really. Oh, after the kingdom divided, which we learned about, the capital city of the northern kingdom was Samaria. So right in the center. So that's it. It's very easy. You could reproduce that on a napkin if someone had a question about these kinds of things. I know a lot of times in a restaurant someone will say, "Hey, can you explain to me where Jerusalem is?" That's a very common question that people ask in restaurants. So
what's the first line that you drew again?
This black line?
Yes.
This is the coast with the Mediterranean Sea over here. And that little bump is Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal and during the drought and
then the curve on the bottom is the road to...
Well, this coast just curves and then you get Egypt down here. It's not a... Yes?
How did Samaria become?
That's what I'm about to say. That's what I'm about to say. It's a good question. So, in the New Testament times, there were 3 regions, which we're going to do. So, basically, if you want to center this around Jerusalem, a little oval, that's Judea. And this is Jerusalem. And then if you want to do a little oval right in the center here is Samaria. Obviously named after the ancient capital city that was, destroyed 7 centuries before.
Is that the northern kingdom now, where Samaria?
This is the New Testament times.
Oh, New Testament.
It used to be the northern kingdom.
How did it become Samaria?
That's what I'm explaining. It used to be the northern kingdom. And when Assyria took it over, they destroyed the capital city and deported 90% of the people. They only left the poorest and least educated people there to work the land because they wanted to be able to get their taxes of produce and items and iron and all that. So they left a few people there to work the land. Then, this was Assyria's MO. When they would take over a kingdom, they would take the people away and put them somewhere else and take people and put them. So they would mix people up because it's much harder to rebel when you're just trying to survive and you're not. It's much harder to be organized in a new place when you don't know how the crops work and all that. So there was all these pagans living here with a few Jews, and they were doing all kinds of pagan things, and so God sent lions among them to kill a bunch of them. And so then the emperor of Assyria said, oh, well, they don't understand the God of this land, so let's send back a scribe or two so they can tell them how to worship the God of this land. And that's the way they thought of gods in ancient times, is localized. And so some scribe came back and taught the people certain things about the law of Moses. So what happened is, as the Jews who were left intermarried with these pagans, and they had a strange amalgamation of worshiping Yahweh and other things, they eventually got their own version of the first 5 books of the Bible that were a little bit different, and they had their own worship site, because obviously they couldn't get to Jerusalem. It was another kingdom. And so there's Mount Gerizim, which was the mountain where Joshua had the people pronounce all the blessings. So that's where they worshipped. Anyway, then this area up here, another oval, is called Galilee. In Matthew, he calls it Galilee of the Gentiles because even though these were the 2 Jewish regions, so let me draw some arrows. These 2 regions had the Jews living in them in New Testament times. This region had the Samaritans, who were half Jewish by race and half Jewish by religion. But Matthew calls this Galilee of the Gentiles because it had a higher Gentile population than Judea did, even though all these areas had some Gentiles living in them. These were the 2 main Jewish areas. And Jesus grew up in this one, but of course every year he would go down for the festivals in Jerusalem, the religious feasts.
How far apart were these?
This is not very far. This is, I'm going to say, about 80 miles apart. So, Dean could bike here in a day, easily.
Electric, right?
No, Dean.
I biked 100 miles before.
Yeah, Dean in 1 year biked the circumference of the earth, 24,000 miles. He's a good biker. But anyway, he does about 75 miles a day. So yeah, you could easily get from here to here on a bike in a day. On foot, it would take longer. It would take maybe four days.
They go around Samaria, wouldn't they? They wouldn't go through it.
Well, it depended on different situations. So while we're here, why don't we look at John chapter 4? If anyone has a Bible, you could read verses 3 and 4 for us.
Just read it this morning, Mary.
So we've got, while you're finding it, I'll label some things. Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean Sea, and then south off our map would be the Red Sea. But we don't need to worry about that. Okay, can someone read John 4, 3 and 4? Verses 3 and 4, real loud so everyone can hear.
When the Lord learned of this, he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria.
Oh. Okay, so he left Judea to go to Galilee and he had to go through Samaria. Obviously, you can see why. I mean, you could have go around as well, but he didn't. Is there one more line in that?
So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph.
Okay, so remember, Jesus is living roughly around the year 0, but it's the same land that his ancestor, Jacob, lived 2,000 years previous. So in the day of Jesus, all these sites were very ancient already, even more ancient now. Okay, so he goes to, stay there, Ellie, if you would, and read verse 9. So he meets this woman at Jacob's well in Sychar.
The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?"
So, is there one more line?
Yeah. For Jews do not associate with Samaritans.
Okay, so obviously the Samaritans were looked down upon as something like half-breeds, but it went much deeper than that. Remember when we talked about how devastating, like psychologically devastating the exile was? As they were brought away from the land, there was all these questions, has God abandoned us, what's going on? And when some of them, they would see some of their children embracing Assyrian and Babylonian ways of life and religion. That was terrible. And they were saying to each other, let's hold on to our national identity. Jeremiah gave a prophecy that God's going to bring us back. You know, they were studying this and hoping for generations. So, by way of analogy, imagine if all Americans, or 95% of Americans, were deported to China. And as you saw your kids grow up, you're like, whoa, no. Don't celebrate Chinese independence. This is the 4th of July and Christmas. We got to hold on to our holidays and our way of life. And someday we're going to go back to America and we're telling them stories about how great it was. Okay, so after 100 years of this, they finally come back. And the Jews who were left, who didn't get deported, who didn't go through that, they had intermarried with pagans. They had synchronized Old Testament religion and embraced all kinds of pagan superstitions and things and mixed it together. So can you imagine the anger that would happen? We struggled in a foreign land and you got to stay, and we remained true, and you didn't? So they were very hated. Just before the time of Jesus, in the age of the Maccabees, the Jews destroyed the temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans hated that, so there's just a lot of anger and contention between these two people. But they still worshiped on that mountain, even though their temple was destroyed in Jesus' day. So, how can you ask me? You're a man, I'm a woman. You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. How can you ask me for a drink? You don't deal with me, you don't talk to me. Besides, if I touch a pot and give it to you, that's going to be, according to you guys, ritually defiled because I'm a Samaritan. What she didn't know was that Jesus cannot be ritually defiled because he purifies everything he touches. All those laws work the opposite of him, for him. Like, if a Jew touches a dead body, the Jew's now unclean and he can't go to service until he washes, right? But when Jesus touches a dead body, even though he's breaking the Old Testament law, he's actually not breaking it, because when Jesus touches him, it comes back to life. So righteousness and life flow out of him. Okay, so, and then verse 20, and that will be done with John 4.
Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem.
Okay, so she knows that we're both descended from Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but you guys have a different place of worship. So Jesus had brought up her sin of adultery, and she immediately changes the topic to something that'll sure to raise a debate, and we can not talk about my life so much anymore, right? So she brings up the religious controversy immediately. Okay, so that's those stories in John 4 are just helpful to work through. Okay, so he's traveling through, he meets this woman. That's why all that's going on. Okay, any questions about this? Okay, this is just 90% of the Bible takes place in these regions, so it's just important to know.
Where is Haifa today? Do you have that?
Right here where Mount Carmel was. It's a big city on Mount Carmel.
Samaria was the capital
Of the north, centuries before Jesus, the northern kingdom's capital was Samaria, for most of it. Actually, it started out as Tirzah, but very quickly in their history, they moved the capital to Samaria.
Jacob, where did they get all the laws that they come back? Those 600 some laws. How did they come in?
It was right out of the law of Moses.
All of it come from Deuteronomy? Or?
Well, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. If you read through and count every command in those books, you'll come up with 613. Yeah. I've never counted them all, but believe me, the Jews have counted them very carefully. They've counted all the letters. They've counted... It's very extensive the way they copy out the law. Okay, so let's turn the page, and now we can get into the history of the New Testament. The history of the Old Testament is 2,000 years long. The history of the New Testament is only 100 years long. So it's much more manageable. I couldn't fit it all in one line, so I divided the page with that black line and got two timelines. Okay, so you can see that even though we count Jesus' birth back to the year 0, technically it was more like 5 BC. So there's the life of Jesus in that blue line. Of course, first couple of years he's in Bethlehem, then the next few years in Egypt. He spends most of his life in Nazareth. And then you see that little line, I'm sorry the font is small, but where it says ministry begins.
Yes.
Look how there he lives in Capernaum. Could someone read Matthew 4? Matthew 4, verses 12 through 17.
Now when he had heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. From that time Jesus began to preach, saying, Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus calls.
Okay.
Is that enough?
That's it, yeah. So that little verse at the end is a summary of Jesus' message. Jesus began to preach from that point. It says he was 30 years old. He stopped at 17, I believe.
17 through 17.
It should be listed there in your notes up above the timeline. It should have the references listed there.
Oh, I see. 12.
So yeah, at age 30, he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. John's arrest seems to act as an indicator to him, now it's time for my ministry to begin. The ministry of the guy who is supposed to prepare the way for me, John, has ended. Now it's time for me to start my ministry. So he moves from his hometown to Capernaum, which Capernaum is a little town right on the coast. Nazareth is here, where he grew up, moves, 10 miles away, well, probably 20 or so, to a little coastal town, and that's where he begins his ministry and draws his first disciples, who are fishermen. And one other thing. Does anyone know why it talks about the land of Zebulun and Naphtali? Anyone know? What's that talking about? Way back, 1,400 years previous, when Joshua came in and conquered the land, he gave out tribal allotments to the 12 sons, the 12 tribes. And up here is where Zebulun and Naphtali had their tribal areas. Of course, upon coming back from the exile, most Jews had lost their tribal divisions. It got all mixed up, so it was important to marry a Jewish person, not necessarily important to stay within your tribe. But that's what it's referring to, those ancient tribal allotments. Okay, so Jesus begins his ministry. He's traveling, preaching, doing miracles, gaining followers, and gaining enemies. That's a very brief summation of all 4 Gospels right there. That's what Jesus is doing during his ministry. And then, of course, all the Gospels lead up to his death and resurrection at the end, when Jesus is 33. And then there's some post-resurrection appearances to various people, sometimes to groups. At one point, a group of 500. And then he ascends, the ascension in blue. And then shortly after that is Pentecost. And what happens at Pentecost?
Holy Spirit comes down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then we see rapid church growth. That first day, 3,000 people get saved, join the church. Then later, it's up to 5,000. And this new truth that Jesus has paid for our sins, that he's the Messiah, that he rose from the dead, all of that is spreading. And they're still considering it a sect of Judaism at this point. It doesn't take long, though, for the Jews who reject this to begin persecution. So let's look at Acts. We're going to look at 1:8 and 8:1.
You want me to go ahead and read?
Yeah, if you have Acts 1:8, that'd be great.
But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you.
Hold on. Okay, so this is the resurrected Jesus talking to the disciples before he ascends, right before he ascends. He says, you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. Keep going.
And you will be my witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth.
Okay, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You notice a progression there? The city of Jerusalem, the region of Judea, and Samaria, another region, and the ends of the earth. So if it were in America, you might say, you'll be my witnesses in Orlando, and in all of Florida, and in Florida and Georgia, other states,
You need to go up north.
and to the ends of the earth. You see the point? A city, a region, another region, the ends of the earth. And as a progression in, also in what would you call that, religiosity, right? The Jerusalem Jews were the best, the Judean Jews were the next best, and then the Samaritans, half Jewish, and the ends of the earth, the Gentiles. And that verse functions as a little outline for the whole book of Acts. So that's what we're going to see, and we're going to see that in the timeline too. But now, could someone read 8:1? The church still has not spread out.
On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria.
Okay, so a great persecution broke out, and everybody except the actual apostles was scattered. So persecution, that's not good, but why did it turn out to be good, do you think?
Church spread.
Yeah. As they were fleeing from persecution, they were spreading the gospel with them. Just like Jesus said, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and as we're going to see, the ends of the earth.
The Romans had built the roads, which made it easy.
Yes, and cleared the Sea of Pirates, which made it easier to sail, and all kinds of things.
Well, the apostles were actually sort of disobeying his command, because he had told them to start in Jerusalem, go to Judea, go to Samaria, and then the ends of the earth.
Yes, but they do, though, ultimately. I don't know.
Right.
I think there's some details as to why in that verse the apostles are not scattered, but they do. Thomas goes east to India. Andrew goes way up north into Romania area. I can't remember where they all go, but they do scatter.
You did the great dispersion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but that you can see that I marked that little. That's when Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is destroyed. But anyway, on our timeline though, we're still at the top, and the last thing is Paul's conversion. Now, Paul's conversion is a big deal. In the book of Acts, we see the main character shift. It's very rare in a book for the main character, for the first half of the book to be one person, the second half of the book is somebody else. That usually doesn't happen in books, but we see the main character shift from Peter to Paul, and the emphasis from Jewish converts to Gentile converts. It's all following Jesus' command and prophecy that this is what's going to happen. So Paul's initial ministries in Antioch were on the bottom half of the timeline now. And you can see the first book of the Bible is written there in the late 40s, the book of James. And that M there, M1, M2, M3, those green boxes with the M's, that stands for Paul's missionary journeys. So he goes on 3 missionary journeys, and even those journeys fulfill what Jesus was saying in that each time he goes a little further. And in the second missionary journey, he stays in Corinth for 2 years, and he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The third missionary journey, he stays in Ephesus for 3 years, and he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians. At the end of his first missionary journey, he wrote Galatians. We're going to come back to talk about each of these a little bit. But you can see all of Paul's letters are just printed, but all the non-Pauline epistles are in gray boxes. Right? And then the 4 Gospels are written in red. Now, some people are surprised that the Gospels are not the first books of the New Testament written. You can see why.
Who wrote Hebrews?
Well, we don't know. It was anonymous.
I think Paul.
Okay, well, maybe he did, but it's anonymous. He didn't. If he wanted us to know, he would have put his name there, like many of the others. But anyway, let's talk about the Gospels a little bit, just briefly, because this is just to give you an overview of the history of what was going on in the New Testament era. the Gospels were written for whom? Do you imagine?
The dispersed Jews.
The church.
For the church, for the Christians. Now, yes, you can read the Gospels and explain the Gospels and tell the stories of the Gospels in order to convert people, but look at what year the first Gospel was written. In the early 60s AD. Jesus had been dead for over 30 years. So initially, the message is going out and people are telling Jesus, everybody knows Jesus. Oh yeah, I went to see him when I was a kid, right? Or I remember when I was a teenager, I saw him. My parents went to see him. Oh yeah, we know all about Jesus. We saw the miracles. We heard his stories. We heard his parables. Remember that one about the prodigal son? Oh yeah, right? So there's all this this body of knowledge about Jesus still alive when people who had seen him and all that. But after 30 years, I'm sure a lot of people were saying, so we've got thousands and thousands of people now worshiping Jesus, trusting in him. But the generation that actually saw him and heard him is dying off. We need this preserved. And that's when Matthew, an eyewitness, said we need to write this down. Mark, who had traveled with Peter, wrote it down from Peter's point of view. Luke, who had traveled with Paul. There's a point in Acts, I think it's in chapter 17, where they're sailing around. Paul did this, they did this, they did this, they did this. Then he stops in one city. Then we sailed. So all of a sudden, Luke, the writer, has joined. And then for the rest of it, it's we did this, we did this. So then Luke travels around with Paul, and he writes his two-volume work, Luke Acts. And then way later, the last one, John writes the last 5 books. Not the last 5 books of the New Testament, but the last 5 that were written. Bronwyn.
So are the Gospels, even though Christ told them to go out into the world, the main focus is to the Jews?
No, they were written for Christians, for the church to preserve and to spread both. It's a dual purpose, to spread the message to others who haven't heard it and also to preserve it for those who know it. This is what Jesus did. So it was very important. They were still preaching that the kingdom was coming. I mean, Acts ends with, and then Paul went to Rome and preached the kingdom. So they were still looking forward to the coming. They were still, all of that, everything that we were still preaching today, they were preaching then.
Where did Paul write Romans?
Right at the end of his 3rd missionary journey. It's there, ROM below that. Yeah. So, he doesn't know at that point that he'll be going to Rome.
Yeah, he hadn't been to Rome yet.
He plans to go freely, but he ends up going in chains. But a couple little notes here. John's the only one who writes after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So that little lightning bolt there is when Jerusalem is destroyed. There were groups of Jews who kept trying to rebel against Rome, and finally Rome had enough. In his prison, his time imprisoned in Rome, in the 4th journey, although it's not a missionary journey, it's a imprisoned journey, he writes a lot of the books of the Bible. So that ends up being really good. If he had gone on to Spain like he had planned, he might not have been able to have the time to write those important letters.
So these epistles of Paul, some of them really say how a church should function. Which books or letters might those be, or would you call it?
Well, certainly 1st and 2nd Corinthians, there was a lot wrong in those churches. So you see a lot of correction. Philippians has some really important information, especially in chapter 3, about the way a church should function. Ephesians has a lot about that. I'd say Ephesians and Philippians are the most
Timothy.
emphasis on the church. Well, the pastoral ones, yeah.
Those were
Yeah, the three pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, there's a lot about a church there, but that's a separate category. I'd like to save that for the next page. I just want to say one last thing about this page. There are some people who make a really strong point to say that when you're reading Matthew, for most of the book, it's in Old Testament times because the cross hasn't happened yet. Okay, that's an important thing to take into consideration. But some people make too big a point about that, not taking into account that these books were written in the church age. So that's just a little theological point. It becomes more and more complex. Okay. Let's turn the page. We'll come back to the timeline, but I just want to make sure we've got some of the geography down. Take a moment and try to identify where we're at. Now, look at, the blue's the water. Can anyone find this map with the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea and the Jordan River? We're zoomed out, so it's going to look a lot smaller. Can anyone find that on there? Yes. Very small, right? Sea of Galilee is that little tiny dot with the Jordan River. So we're way zoomed out, and you can see Italy on the far left. See what things there you can label. There's a list below. Just try to fill them in. That huge white section is the Arabian Desert. So you make a big circle just east of the land of Israel and just south of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this area right here, this is the Arabian Desert. That's going to come into play shortly. Okay. So, does everybody find Greece? Does everybody find Greece? Anybody not find Greece? Okay, good. We're going to zoom in on the Greek area on the next page. Now, this map here is very important on page 4 because this is the main area where Jews of the diaspora went. So in other words, in Old Testament times, when during the exile, Jews who had been sent were moving, Jews were spreading, all throughout Jewish history really, Jews have been moving away from Israel. And this is the main area where they are. The only other area that has any Jewish population is Alexandria in Egypt. But other than that, it's all right here. And every single epistle in the New Testament, other than the ones that doesn't say who they're to, are all on this map. There was a Jewish population near Rome because Pompey brought slaves back from Israel. Pompey, the Roman general. So there was a population in Rome, but everywhere else was right here in Greece and Turkey, what we call Asia Minor. So, let's think about the books of the epistles of the New Testament. Can anyone name an epistle? Philippians. Okay. Let me put it here. I don't really want to totally erase this, but we can do a little bit right here. Okay, so we've got Turkey. Maybe I should have done this. We got Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and we've got Greece and Crete and a bunch of little islands. Okay? Like this. Now, Philippians is a city right here. And Thessalonica is a city right here. So you got two epistles written to two churches not too far from each other in Greece. You can understand why the New Testament was written in Greek.
And then you got Ephesians and Colossians.
So you said Philippians is
Yeah, Philippi and Thessalonica. Philippians and Thessalonians. In this little narrow, what do you call that? Causeway, isthmus? I don't know. But that's Colossians. I'm sorry, no, it's not Colossians. It's Corinth. Yes. It's Corinth. Colossae is over here. And this region is Galatia. Now, Paul's first missionary journeys were essentially through Galatia and back to his home base of Antioch. So if you look back to the timeline, Paul's first missionary journey was through Galatia, and look where he wrote the letter of Galatians. It's right after his missionary journey, his first missionary journey. He goes through those areas, starting churches, different cities, and then he writes a letter to them. Now, look at those first two books. You got James and you got Galatians as the first two books of the New Testament. When you read those, can you tell this is early on? This is really basic stuff. You read James. You have to have faith in Jesus, but faith without works is dead. That's why so many people love James, because it just says it how it is. This is what you need to do. You need to tame your tongue, right? It's very basic stuff. It's the first book of the New Testament written. Galatians now is the first book where there's false teaching creeping in. You know, maybe you have to obey all the Old Testament laws to be a Christian. And so right away, Galatians, very simple, plain, straight theology. No, it's not by the works of the law. It's by faith.
When James was written, was there a lot of confusion about works?
Well, what had happened was the Jews were trying to obey the law, and then the apostles came around and said, no, you don't have to obey the law to go to heaven, you just have to trust in Jesus. So the very first obvious mistake is, well, great, I can just live however I want and just believe in Jesus. Well, that's not right. Faith without works is dead. And then tells you, how you need to live. But then they go the other way and they say, well, if you have to obey these works, then we have to obey everything in the Old Testament. You have to get circumcised to go to heaven. You have to keep all these laws. And he's writing Galatians now. Yeah. And there's, early on, even Peter's a little bit confused about some of the theology going on there. There's a little confrontation in chapter 2, I think, the end of chapter 2, between Paul and Peter of Galatians. Okay, so we're still looking at some of those other ones. You can see all those books of the Bible being written. You got Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth, Colossae, Galatia, Ephesus. Ephesus is a huge deal. It's a very big city, had a very strong church. Guess what? We have Ephesus. I would have loved to have been part of that church, because they had a pastor named Paul. After him, they had a pastor named Timothy. After him, they had a pastor named John the Apostle.
Wow, didn't know that.
Now, when Polycarp followed up John, bit of a disappointment. In Indiana, I followed a pastor who had been beloved pastor for 36 years. That was a tough act to follow. But what would have been really tough was following those three. Polycarp had it. And we still have some of Polycarp's writings.
Wasn't he a Catholic bishop, Polycarp?
Well, there is no Catholicism at this point. This is immediately after the Apostle John. So to say he's Catholic is a little bit anachronistic or something like that. But anyway, Ephesus was a big deal because we have a letter to the church, and we have 2 letters to the church pastor, 1 and 2 Timothy. Right? And then later, when John is exiled to the island of Patmos, he writes this letter of Revelation.
Where's Patmos?
This little island right here. He'd have been pastor here. He writes a letter to the 7 churches. Guess where the 7 churches are? Right there. You can understand why, as pastor here, all these churches would have been, hey, we have a question. Well, there's an actual apostle still alive. Let's go send somebody and ask him. So, even though he was shepherd of this flock, he ended up being a shepherd of all the churches in that area. So he writes his letters to those 7 churches in the book of Revelation.
So when he was in Patmos, was he a prisoner?
He was in exile on an island. Yeah, they marooned him on an island, essentially. And that's where he wrote.
When they boil him and all. Boil him and all. When they
Boil him.
all, then they put him in all.
No, John was the only one that wasn't martyred. Was
No, no, they didn't kill him by oil, as far as I know.
I mean, I thought they punished him. I thought that was one of the...
I don't know what they did, but whatever painful punishment, then they exiled him on this island where he wrote the book of Revelation.
John was the only apostle that wasn't martyred.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, the other 11 were all martyred, and John was exiled.
As a matter of fact, the Lord Jesus spoke about that when they were putting it much closer to the cross. And they said to Peter, it's none of your business what I have planned.
Right. In John 21, yeah, Jesus prophesied that Peter would be...
That proves
martyred.
Jesus more than anything is the 11 apostles, not saying it's a hoax. That proves it more than anything.
Right, yes. That would be for an apologetics course, though. One last thing, this island of Crete right here. Anybody know what letter was written to the Cretans? Cretans are liars, evil beasts, and slow bellies. Titus, right. Titus, Paul leaves Titus, traveled around with Titus a lot, leaves him in Crete to say, go around to all the towns and appoint elders in every city. These churches need pastors. And it's a rough crew, these Cretans. So you're going to have to, the pastors are going to have to be able to refute. You're going to need a no sound doctrine because they're going to have to be able to refute heresies. Because they're coming up with all kinds of other things. So that's one of the other pastoral epistles to Titus on Crete. So, and even 1 and 2 Peter, he says he's written to those scattered in Pontus, Asia, Bithynia. That's all right here. All those little regions that First Peter's written to. Some of the other epistles, it doesn't say who they're written to. But all the ones that do are on this map. Okay. Any questions about this map, or the timeline? Because guess what? This original map here is going to get reinforced. Okay? So with a partner, I've got a little assignment for you. You might not like it, but you're going to do it, and it's going to be beneficial. You're going to have to trust me that it will be beneficial. Okay, this is a very simplified topographical map of the water. I can't make the Dead Sea lower than your table, but if I could, because it's lower than the sea. Yeah, it's way down. That's actually a fault, tectonic fault, where it's actually they're trying to measure to see how fast it's moving apart with lasers across from one mountain peak to the other, and is moving a tiny bit every year. So, 2,000 years ago, it was a couple feet different. It's barely moving. Okay, let's look at this and see why this is important. You don't need to turn there, but in Jonah 8, when he's sitting on the hill to see what happens in Nineveh, it says a scorching east wind. Why is wind from the east hot, do you imagine? Coming off the desert that collects the sun's heat all day. So what if there's a west wind blowing this way? What's it going to bring? It's going to bring rain. So what happens is, if you could look at this, if you could get down on your table and look at it from the side, you would see the coastline up to the mountains, down to the Jordan River, and then up to the mountains in Lebanon again. This is the water. So what happens is, as this air carrying moisture comes, the mountains compress the air and it drops all the rain. So this left side of the country, that's rain and green growth. Gets all the growth. This side now, the air is dumped, right? This is why when I was a little kid living on a certain side of the state, the other side of the state got all the snow from the Great Lakes. And then by the time it got to me, there's not much. I was always disappointed. But that's what happens when the water's here, it dumps the moisture, and then when it comes out, it doesn't. Now it actually picks up. Back when the Jordan River was a huge river, it would pick up and rain here. That's why Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh wanted to stay on that side of the Jordan. So what happens is then, this land becomes your farming land, and this land over here becomes your shepherding land, where you can graze your flocks. So you can see from your topographical map, see how it comes up from the coast. Now this is, do you look how it comes up? Yeah, yes, exactly like that. And so everything on the left of the high point is going to get all the rain in the farmland. The farmers on the other side would have been nomadic, because you graze around. And all throughout history there was big disputes between farmers and shepherds. Going back from the very first two people ever born, Cain and Abel.
How come they were fighting?
Well, because the farmers always look down on the shepherds. We own our land. You can't bring your flocks over here. We own the land. And the shepherds were nomadic, wandering.
So they looked down on
So Cain, the farmer's punishment was to be a wanderer like a shepherd.
Where is Jerusalem on the top of that?
Yeah, so this is very simplified. So what you would actually see if it was actually the world and you were a giant, it would be all of this would be full of little bumps. The hill country would be full of tons of little hills. And one of those little hills right here will be Jerusalem. But there would be little tiny dips between all the hills. So on one of these little bumps, not even the biggest bump.
Is it on the dry side?
It is, yes, it is. However, let me borrow your hill country here. So this is the hill country, and Jerusalem would be right about here. What is actually, though, if this is the north, it's actually tilted a bit like this. And so any rain that there is filters through until it hits bedrock. And then it runs along bedrock. And it comes up in the Gihon Spring in Jerusalem. And that has been like that since well before the time of David, well before the time of Moses. The Jebusites, that was their city, Jebus. Because of that spring. It had always been, it's still there today. You can still go see the Gihon Spring. Well, you can't see the spring, but you can see and walk in the waters of it. So it's just barely tilted, and all that rainwater constantly year-round runs up and comes in. So that's why it was an important city, because it had the natural, continual water source. That's why it could withstand siege in the days of Hezekiah. Okay, so this little, should have a little, let me erase some stuff. A little triangular valley in the Galilee region, like this. This is very important. Should have something like this up here, and the hills here. And this little triangular valley is called the Jezreel Valley. It's some of the best farmland in Israel. It was very, very lucrative. And there's a town right here called Megiddo. It's on a hill, and the word for hill or mountain is Har. So Har Megiddo, where we're getting the name Armageddon. There have been more battles fought here than anywhere else in the world. At Armageddon. Har Megiddo. The very first battle recorded in history was fought right here. The very last battle in history will be fought right here. This town controls the Jezreel Valley, and it controls a mountain pass. It's the world's most important trade route, or was until, modern times. I mean, from Asia to Africa, if you wanted to trade between those two continents, you had to come through this mountain pass, controlled by this walled city. Napoleon, when he looked out across this valley, you know what he said? That's the world's perfect battlefield. He said there's enough space there for all the armies of the earth to maneuver their troops.
So it's in Revelation too, right? Armageddon?
It is. It is in Revelation, yes. Let's see. Got some other... Yeah. Okay, why do we have this huge freshwater lake right here, do you suppose? The Sea of Galilee.
Because God put it there.
Well,
That's a good answer.
that's true. But what were his means for of putting it there and keeping it filled?
Provides water for...
Yeah, that would be his reason. It does. It provides water. They pump millions of gallons out of there to irrigate constantly, and it's the biggest issue in Israel is the Sea of Galilee. And it's a big political issue. They're making a line, and they're saying, this is the line. If it gets down to this line, then we're going to stop pumping water out. And then it gets down below that line, and they say, well, if it gets down below this line. And then sometimes they say, well, let's just move the line. And what's the point of a line if you move the line? And so there's just all kinds that's in the newspaper. It's a big, huge issue because they need that water. They haven't had a really good year of rain since the 90s. So that's what they need. But if you can tell, and I know the map that I've had you build is crude, but if you can tell, it's a bowl, and there's highlands all around it. So you see Mount Hermon up at the top, the highest point. If you go from Mount Hermon down to the Lebanon highlands, that whole area is higher than the Sea of Galilee. So you've got, Mount Hermon here, these mountains here, these mountains here. It forms a bowl. And so any rain that comes flows in all these little creeks and streams. Mountains of Lebanon up here, all these little creeks and streams flow down, and it collects there. And it empties out. Now, as it gets lower and lower, it empties out less and less. And fills the Jordan River, which fills this. And this is getting lower and lower, too. And to the point where actually you can walk across now in certain places.
It must be very deep,
What must be deep?
that little thing.
Oh, the Sea of Galilee. Yes, it is deep. It's very deep. I mean, this is the lowest point on earth. This, okay, so well before Abraham, ancient prehistoric history, Sodom and Gomorrah were down here. Sulfur and fire rained from heaven. I don't know what happened, but something cataclysmic happened, and the earth shifted, and these places, this land sunk to, thousands of feet below sea level. Now, early 90s, they had a really bad drought, and the water got really low, and they found a boat that was 2,000 years old, and you can go see it. And they built reconstructions of a boat. This is what boats looked like in Jesus' day.
Was it Noah's Ark?
It was not Noah's Ark, but it was.
Noah's Ark's Turkey, they thought.
Well, Noah was way before Jesus. 3,000 or 4,000 years before Jesus. But from the time of Jesus, they found a boat there, which would have been like a common fishing boat they would have used in those days.
I have a question about, to the west of the Sea of Galilee is Galilee. So it's highlands, but it's not a mountain.
This is just the region of Galilee.
But must be high land.
It's definitely higher. And this is a valley, but it's still, this is a valley, but it's not low enough to be a lake. If it were lower, it would fill up as a lake, but it doesn't. The water runs. Now, if stuff over here is going to run out to the sea, but most of the rain that falls here runs into the Sea of Galilee.
Do they get their drinking water out there today?
I would imagine their drinking water comes through some sort of purification system.
They have desalinization.
That's what I mean, they put
Yeah.
it out there.
But drinking,
Desalinize it.
yeah.
They have multiple.
But to irrigate all their farmland, and they were not doing that pre-1948, so the land was a lot worse before the Jews got a hold of it in the late 40s, and they worked it and irrigated, and so of course I imagine if a Palestinian were telling this, they'd have.
But where's the Palestinians in reference to this?
Well, the Palestinians were in this whole land, but in 1947 and 48, the Jews came in and took it all and just pushed them out.
They're over here.
Gaza's down there.
Well, yeah, but what has happened is since then they've given them what they call the West Bank, this region here, for the Palestinians, and then the Gaza Strip. They keep giving back more and more land. Yeah, sorry, Bronwyn.
I'm sorry, go ahead. The Sea of Galilee is the inlet for the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea is the outlet. And you've got fresh water going down, becoming salt.
That's a very good question. What happens is, as the water evaporates out of here, just because it's hot, it's like a desert here, the salt stays. So the salt's there, but it just stays. Fresh water flows into it. If the water wasn't evaporating out, then it would get less and less salty. But as much as flowing in is evaporating out. So the salt just stays. And you can see that it used to be higher because you walk the first couple feet going down to the water, it's just like covered in salt.
You got the same thing with Great Salt Lake in Utah.
Oh, is that how that works? I never knew. I've never been there. But yeah, a little bit more salt here though. So the Sea of Galilee is shaped like this with a little opening in the front for water to flow out. Just
Is that how it is?